My name is Rosa Mendez. I am 67 years old. I came to America from Mexico in 1981 with one suitcase, $43, and a photograph of my mother that I kept folded in my left shoe because I was afraid someone would steal my bag on the bus. And I want to tell you something before I tell you anything else. I want to tell you that I never once in 42 years felt sorry for myself. Not when I was scrubbing floors at 4 in the morning in a hotel in downtown Chicago while the guests slept in their warm beds. Not when my English was so broken that cashiers at the grocery store would sigh loudly when it was my turn in line. Not when my own son Daniel looked at me across the dinner table when he was 16 years old and said, "Mom, please stop talking when my friends are here, because your accent is embarrassing." I never felt sorry for myself because I did not come to America to feel sorry for myself. I came to America to build something. And that is exactly what I did. Quietly, patiently. Without telling a single person, including my own children, for 42 years I built, and I built, and I built. And then one ordinary Tuesday morning, my son Daniel walked into a glass office building on Michigan Avenue in Chicago wearing his best suit. Carrying his best resume, heart full of hope, sat down across from the hiring manager, and was told that the final decision on his application would come from the company owner. And when that door opened and he looked up to see who walked in, the expression on his face was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life, because the person who walked through that door was me. His mother, the woman with the broken English. The woman he had been ashamed of his entire life. The woman he thought was nobody. And I sat down across from my son, folded my hands on the desk, looked him directly in the eyes, and said in my broken English that he had always hated, "So Daniel, tell me, why should I give you this job?" But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you all the way back to the beginning, because if you do not understand where I came from, you will not fully understand what that moment in that office meant, and I want you to understand it completely. I grew up in a small town called Silo in the state of Guanajuato in Mexico. My father worked at a shoe factory, and my mother cleaned the church every Saturday morning and took in laundry from neighbors to make extra money. We're not rich. We were not poor. We were somewhere in the middle, where there is just enough to survive, but never quite enough to dream. And I was the oldest of 5 children, which meant I understood from a very young age that dreaming was something you did, quietly and carefully, and never out loud, because out loud dreams had a way of disappointing people. I was 22 years old when my cousin Alina, who had been living in Chicago for 3 years, called me and said, "Rosa, there is work here. Real work. Come." And I remember sitting on the edge of my bed that night, looking at the ceiling and thinking about what real work meant, because real work to me meant a future. And a future meant my children would not grow up in the space between just enough and never quite enough. So I saved for 8 months, borrowed the rest from my uncle, bought a bus ticket. And on a gray Tuesday morning in March 1981, I arrived at the bus station in Chicago with one suitcase. $43, a photograph of my mother in my left shoe, and absolutely no English except for 3 words. "Thank you, please." My cousin Alina helped me find a room in a house she shared with 4 other women from Mexico. We each paid $30 a month and shared 1 bathroom and 1 small kitchen, and we never complained, because we had all left places where $30 a month for a room felt like luxury. And within 1 week, I had my first job cleaning rooms at the Lakeside Hotel on Michigan Avenue. I worked the early morning shift, which meant I was there at 4:30 in the morning and finished by 1 in the afternoon. And then I would walk to my second job, which was washing dishes at a small Italian restaurant 3 blocks away, where the owner, Mr. Caruso, was the first American who ever spoke to me slowly and kindly without sighing. And I worked there until 9 at night, and then I walked home, ate whatever Alina had left on the stove, and slept for 6 hours, and then I did it all again. 6 days a week, every single week, for 2 years without stopping, and I saved every dollar I possibly could, because I had a plan, and the plan required money, and the money required sacrifice, and I had already decided that. Sacrifice was something I was very good at. In 1983, I met my husband Carlos at a church social that Lena dragged me to on a Sunday afternoon, when I was so tired I fell asleep sitting up twice during the sermon. Carlos was funny and warm and hardworking, and he made me laugh for the first time since I had left Mexico, and we got married 6 months later in a small ceremony at that same church, with Alina as my witness and Mr. Caruso from the restaurant as Carlos's witness, because neither of us had family close enough to come. And I want you to know that it was the happiest day of my life, even though my dress was borrowed and the flowers were from a grocery store. And we had our reception dinner at the restaurant where I washed dishes because Mr. Caruso closed early. That Sunday, and cooked for us himself, it was the happiest day because I had. Carlos and I had my plan, and I had my whole future ahead of me, and I was not afraid of any of it. Our son Daniel was born in 1985, and our daughter, Sophia, was born in 1987, and everything I did from those 2 days forward, I did for them. Every early morning, every late night, every dollar saved, every sacrifice made, I did it because I wanted them to have the life that I had come to America to find, and for many years that was enough. That was more than enough. Just knowing they were healthy and safe and had more than I had was enough to keep me going on the days when my feet hurt. So badly I had to soak them in hot water for an hour before I could sleep. But children grow up, and growing up in America when your mother speaks broken English, and your father works construction, and you live in a neighborhood that is not the neighborhood your school friends live in, has a way of doing things to a child's heart that you do not always see happening until it is already done. Daniel was a smart boy, brilliant actually. He learned English so fast it made my head spin. By the time he was 8 years old, he was reading books that I could not understand. By 12, he was correcting my English at the dinner table, gently. At first, Mama, it is not I go to store, it is I went to the store, and I would smile and repeat it and practice it later when no one was listening. But by the time he was 15, the corrections were not gentle anymore. They were sharp and sometimes cruel in the way that teenagers can be cruel without fully understanding what they are doing. Mama, please don't call the school office anymore. They can't understand you. Mama, please don't come to my open house night. Mama, please let me order the food when we go to restaurants. I want to be honest with you. Each one of those moments hurt. They hurt in a place I did not show anyone. I kept that hurt very private because I understood that Daniel was not a bad boy. He was a boy who wanted to belong somewhere, and he had decided that belonging meant leaving behind the parts of himself that looked and sounded like me. And I had decided that my job was to love him through that, even when it cost me something, even when the cost was high. By the time Daniel was in high school, he was exceptional. Top of his class, debate team, student council president, and I went to every single event, even when he asked me not to. I sat in the back so he would not see me easily. I wore my best clothes. I kept my mouth shut unless someone spoke to me directly. And I watched my son shine on those stages with a pride so fierce it sometimes made my eyes fill up right there in those auditorium seats. Because whatever he thought of my English, whatever he felt about my accent, he was brilliant, and he was mine, and I had worked every single day of his life to give him the platform he was standing on. Even if he did not know it, even if he would never know it, it was enough for me to know. Carlos and I sent Daniel to the University of Illinois on a scholarship that he earned himself because my son was that smart. And I want to be clear about that. Daniel's intelligence was never something I could take credit for. That was his, and his alone. What I could take credit for was making sure he never had to worry about anything else while that intelligence was growing. No financial stress, no instability, no coming home to an empty refrigerator. Those things I handled quietly, behind the scenes, the way I had always handled everything. What Daniel did not know, what neither of my children knew, was what I had been doing with my time and my money for the past 20 years while they were growing up. It started small, very small. In 1986, when Daniel was 1 year old and I was still cleaning rooms at the Lakeside Hotel, I noticed that the cleaning supply company that serviced the hotel was doing a very poor job. The products were cheap. They left residue on the surfaces. The hotel manager, Mr. Patterson, complained about it every single week. And one afternoon, I went to Mr. Patterson, and I said in my broken English, that was already better than it had been, but still far from perfect. Mr. Patterson, I think I can do better than this company. Give me 2 weeks and $60, and I will show you. And Mr. Patterson, who was a practical man, looked at me for a long moment and said, Rosa, if you can solve this problem, I will pay you double what that company charges. And I said, deal. And I went home and I spent 3 days researching. Cleaning formulas at the library, using a Spanish-English dictionary. And then I spent $30 on ingredients and made my first batch of cleaning solution in my kitchen with Sophia on my hip and Daniel watching cartoons on the floor. And I brought it to the hotel and I cleaned an entire floor with it, and it was better, significantly better. And Mr. Patterson paid me and fired the other company on the spot, and that was the beginning. Over the next 10 years, while Carlos was working construction and the children were in school, I built a cleaning supply business out of that kitchen. One client at a time, starting with that hotel, then the restaurant where I used to wash dishes, then 2 more hotels, then a hospital. And I incorporated the business in 1991 under the name RM Supply Solutions, and I did not tell Carlos everything right away because I needed to know it was real before I made it real to anyone else. And by the time I told him in 1993, it was generating more money per month than his construction salary and mine combined. And Carlos sat at the kitchen table and looked at the papers I spread in front of him, and he cried, not because he was sad, but because he said, Rosa, I always knew you were going to do something like this, I just did not know when. And that was one of the best moments of my marriage. By 2005, Malaysian Ringgit Supply Solutions had contracts with 47 hotels, 12 hospitals, and over 200 commercial buildings across the Chicago metropolitan area. We employed 112 people. I had moved out of the kitchen and into a proper facility, and I had bought our first real home in a neighborhood that Daniel would not have been embarrassed to bring his friends to. Though by that point, Daniel was in college and did not bring friends home much at all. I kept the business quiet from my children deliberately, not to hide it from them permanently, but because I had watched what happened to other families when children grew up knowing there was money, how it changed their hunger, how it softened their drive, and Daniel had hunger and drive that I was not willing to interfere with. So I kept the house modest. I kept my car modest. I kept my lifestyle exactly as it had always been. And I let my children believe that things were comfortable, but not exceptional. And they believed it because children believe what they see, and I was careful about what I let them see. Daniel graduated from University of Illinois with honors, got his MBA from Northwestern 3 years later, and went to work for a series of large corporations in Chicago where he climbed quickly because he was genuinely talented. And I watched. From a careful distance with enormous pride and that same private hurt that had lived in me since he was 15, because Daniel was now a fully grown, successful man, and he still did not bring me to his work events, still apologized for my accent. When he had to introduce me to colleagues, still answered questions about his background with vague answers that left out the part where his mother was an immigrant who cleaned hotel rooms. And I understood it, I truly did. In the corporate world he had built for himself, I was a complication. And Daniel had always been very good at managing complications. In 2019, my husband Carlos died of a heart attack on a Wednesday afternoon in April, and that loss broke something in me that is never fully healed. Carlos was my partner in every sense of the word. He knew everything. He supported everything. He was the only person who saw the whole picture of who I was. And losing him made me look very carefully at my life and ask myself some hard questions about what I had been waiting for and why. And one of the answers I arrived at was that I had been waiting to see if Daniel would ever choose me on his own, would ever introduce me proudly on his own, would ever stop being ashamed on his own. And the honest answer that came back to me in those quiet months after Carlos died was no, he would not. Not without something changing, not without some moment that reordered his understanding of who his mother actually was. And I began to think about what that moment might look like. The opportunity came in the spring of 2022 when RM Supply Solutions was expanding into a new division and I needed a director of business development. My HR team had been interviewing candidates for 6 weeks without finding the right person. And then one afternoon, my assistant Maria came into my office and said, Mrs. Mendez, there is a very impressive application here from a Daniel Mendez. MBA Northwestern, 8 years corporate experience. And she slid the resume across my desk. I sat very still for a moment looking at my son's name on that paper. And then I looked at his address, which was an apartment 12 minutes from my office that I had driven past 100 times, and I thought about the 16-year-old boy who told me to stop talking when his friends were around, and the 25-year-old who apologized for my accent at his company Christmas party, and the 40-year-old man who had told his girlfriend that his mother was a retired housekeeper because it was easier than explaining the truth. And I made a decision. I told Maria to schedule him for the full interview process. Every round, every evaluation, and to say nothing about ownership. And I want you to know that I did not do this to humiliate my son. I want to be very clear about that. I did it because I loved him, and because I had run out of other ways to show him who I was. And I thought that maybe if he saw it this way, if he walked into it himself without me arranging it for him, might finally land in a place inside him that all my quiet years of building had never been able to reach. Daniel passed every round of the interview process on his own merit because he was genuinely qualified for the position. I watched his evaluations, and his scores were excellent, and on the day of the final interview, I put on my best suit, which is a very good suit because I can afford very good suits, though Daniel did not know that. And I walked into the conference room where he was waiting, and I watched his face go through more emotions in 4 seconds than I had seen from him in 4 years. Shock first, then confusion, then a strange suspended moment where I could see him trying to make sense of what his eyes were telling him, and then something that I can only describe as a reckoning. A moment where everything he thought he knew began to reorganize itself into a new shape. And I sat down across from him, and I folded my hands on the desk, and I said in my broken English, "So Daniel, tell me, why should I give you this job?" And the silence that followed lasted a very long time. He did not answer right away. He looked at the table, then at me, then at the room around him, at the framed certificates on the wall, at the company logo on the glass door, at the photograph on my desk, which is a photograph of Carlos and me, taken in 1993, the year I first told Carlos about the business. And then he looked back at me, and his eyes were full in a way I had not seen since he was a small boy, and he said, "Mama," in a voice so quiet I almost did not hear it, just "Mama," and then he stopped, and I waited. And after a long moment he said, "How long?" And I said, 42 years, Daniel. The same 42 years you have been alive." And he put his face in his hands, and he sat like that for what felt like a very long time while I sat across from him, and did not rush him, and did not fill the silence, because some silences need to be felt completely before they can be moved through. When he looked up, his face was different. Something had shifted in it that I had been waiting a very long time to see. And he said, "Mama, why did you never tell me?" And I said, "Because I needed to see who you would become without knowing, and I needed you to see who I was without me having to explain it." And he nodded slowly, like a man receiving something he had not known he was waiting for. And then he said, "I have been so ashamed." And I said, "I know." And he said, "I am sorry, Mama." And I said, "I know that too," and then I did something I had not planned to do. I got up from my side of the desk, and I walked around to his side, and I put my arms around my son the way I had when he was small, before the embarrassment, before the corrections, before the apologies, and he held on in a way that told me that somewhere underneath all those years of distance he had been waiting for this moment just as long as I had. Daniel got the job, he earned it fairly, and he has done excellent work. And something else happened too, something I could not have planned or predicted. He started talking about me differently. At his next work event, he introduced me to his colleagues, not as his retired mother, but as the founder of the company. And I watched him say it with a straightness in his spine that was new, a pride that was new. And I thought about that 16-year-old boy at the dinner table, and I thought about the 42 years between that dinner table and this moment, and I felt something release in my chest that I had been holding for a very long time. I still speak with an accent. My English is still not perfect. I still sometimes choose the wrong word or put things in the wrong order. And Daniel no longer apologizes for any of it. Last month at a dinner with some of his colleagues, one of them made a small joke about something I said, and Daniel looked at that man with a calmness that was more powerful than anger and said, "My mother came to this country with $43 and built a company that employs over 200 people. Her English is fine." And I looked at my son in that moment, and I thought, yes. Yes, that is the boy I always knew was in there. It's the one I was building everything for. The one I never stopped believing in, even when believing cost me something. And I picked up my wine glass, and I said in my broken English that I have decided. I am no longer going to apologize for, thank you, Daniel. And he raised his glass back to me and said, "No, Mama, thank you," and that was enough. After 42 years, that was more than enough.